Hi, I'm William. I didn't expect to be doing any Blender tutorials on this channel. I'm not exactly a Blender expert, but I figured out a cooler way, from my perspective, to do projection mapping if you don't want to have your UV maps be project from view, and if you don't want crazy subdivisions. So, I think I've done this right. So in a moment we're going to open up Blender, but I want to talk through what we're doing first. So you may be familiar with this scene. This is a classroom scene used for demonstrating lighting in Blender. I have rendered this out just as a familiar scene, but we're not actually using that, we're using this. So for projection mapping, if you're unfamiliar, these smooth surfaces are going to do better than something with it. All I've done is remove all these chairs and this desk and the material on the desk. So we should be able to projection map the floor a lot more cleanly than if this image had a bunch of chairs in front of it. So just in terms of choice of image, it's a mostly empty room. I've left some pieces of furniture here, and we'll see how they affect our output. So before I actually open up Blender, I'm going to open up fSpy. If you're unfamiliar with fSpy, it is a program, it's a free program, maybe open source, I don't know. Interacts directly with Blender. So if you don't have fSpy, you'll want to download it and you'll want to install the add-on. I'm going to walk through how to do all this first, and then I'll talk about how to install fSpy, and I'll talk about how this is better than the other way to do projection mapping at the end of the video, after I actually show you how to do this. So we'll start by opening fSpy. Again, if you don't have fSpy, I'll show you how to install it at the end of the video. So it asks for an image. We're using our classroom without furniture. I'm going to use the JPEG just so that you can see that with a lossy file type we can still do this. Then we start to line these things up. You want to find lines on your image that line up with your geometry. So you can see I'm kind of following these lines in the room. I find that this is easier when you turn off dim image, and then what you want to do is start to drag these around and press and hold shift, and you'll get a better guide for this, and you want that cross to line up right on these lines. And once we line these up really well, I'm going to turn this 3D guide on as an XY grid floor. And I can drag this around and to sit on the floor for just a minute. I'm going to drag these around, and you can see how it's adjusting where it thinks the world is aligned based on how we're dragging around these guides. Now you got to be careful of your geometry. You might guess that it is a straight line from all the way over here to all the way over here. We'd like these points to be as spread out as possible, but if you look closely at this image, the room actually backs out a little over here. There's a little corner of the room there. So just this is a far better technique the better you do this. So I did this once with this image and tried to stretch across the whole room, and we got a little more weird stretching than I was comfortable with. So now I'm pretty much ready to export to Blender, except you can see my z-axis is pointing downward. I don't really like that, so I've got to pick whether I want the x-axis to go in the opposite direction it currently is, or the y-axis to go in the opposite direction it currently is, and that'll make the z-axis go up. In this case, I want to the right to be positive x, so I'm going to change the direction of the x-axis, and now suddenly we're good. The z-axis is pointing up, the x-axis swapped, and I can just keep dragging this around, and I just want to see if it feels like, as I drag it around the room, if it feels like it's lining up with these things, like it lines up with the floorboards. Yeah, that's good. That's good. You can change this around to, say, a box, if you wanted to check this against the wall back here. I don't know. So We're going to do File, Save or Save As, fSpy Classroom. So this is all lined up with the classroom, and all that file saved was this image, and it saved these alignments to the image with all this data that it's calculated. It's basically, the whole point of this is to calculate the camera position and its field of view. Great. I happen to know that the field of view that I rendered this in was something like 39.6, so that's pretty close. I don't know how much better I could get it, but I feel pretty good about this. We're going to switch to Blender. I'm going to open up a new Blender file so you can see this right from the beginning. So again, you'll need the Blender add-on, but we're going to import that fSpy file that we just generated. fSpy Classroom. So what has this just done? It added a new camera to our scene, and that camera, if you look at the camera settings, has background images enabled, and it has loaded up the image out of the fSpy file, essentially, with the correct camera dimensions that it calculated. That's all stored in the fSpy file. Our camera is now currently calibrated to fit in the scene. So we should see that if we move this cube up by 1 meter, we should see that it feels like it's moving along the floor of this image. Personally, I'm going to turn the opacity way up on this. Background image, opacity, crank that up. Okay, so now it feels like this cube is actually in our scene. Having the cube there is convenient because I'm actually going to turn it into our room entirely. So this bottom face of the cube is already on the floor. That's great. I'm going to keep that cube aligned with the floor, push it back to the wall until it feels like it's lined up with the wall. And we'll have the chance to adjust this more. Great. I'm going to tab into edit mode. You could do all this with scaling outside of edit mode. I don't want to. So I just selected this side. I want this side to line up with that far edge in the window. No, I want this side to line up with this edge. At this point, I'm going to just expand this cube out, going into wireframe mode so that I can see all these points. And realistically, I didn't need to see the sides of the cube anyway. What I need to see are the wireframe and how it lines up with this building. Remember how I said this wall was kind of inset over here? You can see that this line does not line up with this wall. So instead of trying to get it to line up with that wall, I want this line to line up with this wall, right? So I'm not trying to get this to line perfectly up with that corner. I'm just making that decision. Later I might inset this to get that looking right, but okay. We basically just want to get, I just pressed 3 so that I can select this face at once, 0 on the number pad to get back into looking from the camera's perspective. I want to move this upward until I feel like I'm at ceiling level, which, you know, somewhere, I just looked at this corner. There's some molding over the corner, but somewhere right in here is probably about right. Great, let's select this front face and move it towards us. Now this one, simply moving towards the camera, the main important part of this is that this face gives enough room on the side. We want this to come as far back. We have nothing to align this to other than just to make sure that we can see the full part of the scene. So we're just cutting off this corner. I'm going to stop moving this back at this point. That's good. So I feel like we have the dimensions of this scene. One last thing I'm going to do, you can see that we have this cube face that we probably don't want. I'm just going to delete that face. We're left with only the faces that actually show up in this room. So we can just look into the room. Okay. Now, one last thing before where'd my notes go? One last thing before we go into shading. I'm going to tab out of edit mode. No, still in edit mode. Okay, before we go into shading, and we'll actually close this, I'm going to select all. I'm going to press 1 on the numbers above the keyboard. Select all with A and U to UV unwrap. I'm going to do Smart UV Project, and here's the important part about this. Eyelid margin needs to be more than 0. Just take a tiny little bit of eyelid margin. I'll explain at the end of the video why we do that. Let me make a note. Great. I'll show you in UV editing. If we're still in edit mode, if I hit A, did I not actually do it? Smart UV Project. Give it some eyelid margin. Okay, that's what it should look like. Okay, these sides spread out around this, and a moment ago it was showing the default cube's UV projection, and I didn't want that. This is our projection now, and all these have little gaps in them. That's kind of what we want. Now, as far as this goes, this is how I'm doing it. Specifically UV unwrapping, what's great about what I'm showing you is that as long as you have a UV unwrapping, this will work, and you don't have to do project from view. So whereas the old method requires you to have a specific UV unwrapping, this will use whatever UV unwrapping you have. In this case, it's convenient that we have island margins, but you can use whatever UV unwrapping you've got. Shading. So we're moving to shading. This camera, by the way, is not important. You can delete that if you want. I will. I'm going to delete it. It's no longer really relevant anyway, since this has what we need for the scene. Okay. At the end of this, you'll be able to use whatever camera you want. But here is the difference in what we're doing from what the older projection map method does. Let's get rid of the principled, and let's take a look at windowed coordinates. So input texture coordinate, and we're going to go down here to window. Window coordinates mark the bottom left corner of your window as 0, 0, and then goes from 0 to 1 up and 0 to 1 all the way to the side, no matter where your object appears in the screen. So it's entirely based on where you're looking, what color this object ends up as, which is exactly what we want, because when I add in an image texture, we're going to temporarily be using this original texture. And we'll set it not to repeat, but to clip. When we connect window coordinates into the vector coordinate of the image appears properly in the screen. Now if I start to rotate, you'll see the same thing happening that was happening before. What we want is to go into the perspective of this camera, and then smack this image against the wall and have it stick there, so that then I can rotate around and look at the scene as if it hasn't, as if it's its 3D self. So you can see currently, if I disconnect window coordinates, currently any image without a vector as intended is mapped from its UV coordinates. So if I look at the UV map here, selecting all these faces. For example, this top face is this rectangle here. So on this image that we're viewing, since we didn't give any default coordinate other than a UV coordinate, this rectangle here will show up as the top surface of the of this scene. So as the ceiling, essentially. What we're about to do is use this UV map to generate an image where on this image, this portion of the image is the actual ceiling. And so let's go do that. So for now we are going to use window coordinates on this image because the UV coordinates for this image are meaningless. I'm going to duplicate this. So we've got window coordinates connected into the vector here. This one remains connected to nothing. Cut that out. Open. No, don't open anything. Don't open anything. This one we're about to generate. So, classroom projected, and we can make this be 2048 by 2048. Make it as big as you need based on the quality that you're expecting. All that's fine. So this is going to be generated. So Blender has this feature that makes what I'm talking about possible with cycles called baking. Specifically baking in the context of generating the entire texture all over this object and then saving it saving it as a single image based on its UV map, so you won't have to calculate it later. The reason that's useful to us is that calculating it later, when the camera's in a different position, let's move the camera. Oh, look, it's entirely not useful. So we want to calculate it once in this position and never calculate it again. So the way to bake a texture in Blender is to select this image, select the object, so our cube, our scene cube, that we're baking to, and baking doesn't show up if you have Eevee selected, but just for this step you have to enable cycles. I'll use GPU. You can disable cycles after you use this, but you need cycles for this particular feature. What we want to bake is this texture as it currently stands on the object. And it is coming out of an emission shader. So we want to set the bake type to emission, and the rest of this we won't have to mess with. So bake type is emission, since this is an emission shader. And we have this selected, we have this selected, and we hit bake. That shouldn't take too long. It took about a minute just now. That's not true. It took less than a minute. I wasn't counting. Basically, though, since we had this selected, this image has now been populated like so. If we go back to the UV editing, earlier we did this test where we selected the ceiling. Now you can see that the ceiling's location on this new image is the actual ceiling. These are the lights that were on the ceiling. This is the beam that ran across the ceiling, albeit a bit stretched. This is what we should be looking at. All of these are correctly mapped this way, which means in our shading tab, without any vector plugged into here, which remember means it's going to default to UV coordinates, mean we can view this image. We're currently from the camera view, so it should look exactly the same. But if I start to move, it is magical. I'll never get over UV projection. I'll never get over how cool this is. So essentially, that baking step is all I have to show you. I'll show you how to save this part. Easy enough. You have an image viewer open here. You probably have an image viewer open in UV editing. Basically, anywhere you can select the image and hover over the actual viewing area and hit Alt-S. Select your area, save that image, and then you're done. Yeah, since you've saved that image, you could then go in and for example, this wall, these radiators cover up a lot of this wall, so you could, having exported that image, go into Photoshop, for example, find the area with the wall and just put a new wall over your radiators. So from here, I'm going to take a look at mapping some more complicated geometry onto this. You can make this a little better by popping this beam out, this beam that's flattening against the wall. There's this vertical thing here, and we could make these radiators project onto cubes also. I'll also talk about how to download and install fSpy, and then talk about island margins, why I had you in your UV projection use an island margin.